Florida State competes in the ACC Tournament in softball this week. They enter as the 2 seed, and we wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about that. I've got Alex Powers, former FSU softball player and current ACC Network Analyst. Alex, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. So we will just address it straight up. This last weekend of FSU softball stunk and just wasn't fun. Friday, weird series that they ended up canceling Sunday because of expected weather. They ended up playing a doubleheader on Friday. Coming off of a really emotional UF game, I saw your studio coverage for that and know that you were exhausted even just after watching that game, like we all were. I know that they would never want to make excuses. I know that we'll talk about that Syracuse series in a second, but do you think the emotions of Wednesday night maybe carried over into that Syracuse series? Like, what do you kind of think about just the way that series got off to a really weird start?
Yeah, I think emotion and something that athletes play with, like that kind of the highs and the lows, momentum especially, is something that always carries over into different games, right? Of course, we try not to let that happen, but I always think it is a bit of a factor. But, you look at elite level teams, and Florida State has proven themselves to be an elite program, and the emotions and riding the highs and the lows can affect the win-loss column like that. And I think that's the biggest marker for me right now is you've got to be more mature than that. You've got to be able to look past that and to not allow that to seep into the wins and losses that you're experiencing. So yes, I think that does happen. I think emotions are a huge part of our game, a huge part of our success and our failure. But how can we best equip ourselves as athletes and great programs, great teams, so that that doesn't happen and doesn't affect those victories, right? And so it's tough. It hurts. And if you're Florida State, obviously, you don't like losing that last series to Syracuse.
Yeah. Then you not only had the emotions of Wednesday night and then having to turn around the next morning and get on a plane to go to Syracuse, but then they switched the series around, make Friday a doubleheader, and, uncharacteristically lost the first game. And it had a lot to do with, defensively, Florida State just wasn't very good, which has always kind of been a staple. I mean, Florida State's been, really good in everything, hitting, defense, and pitching for a long time. So honestly, when any of the one is not there, you're like, well, what do we got here? But defense just not great. In that first game, pitching kind of let you down a little bit too. And then, as a hitter, Florida State's offense could set records this year for being the most prolific offense that by average and runs per game and stuff like that Florida State's ever had. But when your pitching isn't necessarily up to snuff in a game, how hard is it as a hitter to not start to press or start to do too much? Because it almost felt like, Syracuse was giving up a lot of runs this year, but the offense didn't really come through very big either.
Yeah, I think that's been a consistent through Florida State's season this year is their pitchers have struggled. We know that they don't have the depth in the circle right now, and they are also facing a little bit of adversity with what I believe to be just some injuries and what have you. I think those are not controllable at this point. But again, when you don't have the dominance in the circle, of course it's going to put a strain on your offense because as hitters, we feel like we've got to score 10 plus runs. And that's a lot of pressure to put on ourselves, especially when I'm only one person and I can't do it all myself, right? So it's a total team effort, and knowing that we need significant run production, it puts the pressure on everybody. So you start as a hitter expanding your zone, you're swinging at pitches outside of your power alley and your zone that that you can hammer hard. And so when you start talking about pressure, that affects approach. And when you start talking approach, that affects outcome and results, right? And so it's kind of just this trickling domino effect that is tough. But again, Florida State has known that the last couple of years. This is not something, or not even years, just months, as much this season. Like, this is not something that's brand new right now, heading into May. This is something that they've been trying to navigate ever since February, and quite frankly, a little bit before February too, because I don't think Lonnie walked into the beginning of the season not knowing what all she had in the circle.
So they split on Friday. By splitting, you no longer had a chance to get the 1 seed in Durham this week, which we'll talk about the ACC tournament here in a moment. But they get to Saturday, and they start well. They start out with a 3-run bomb from Michaela. They start out with a lead, And unfortunately, just the staff couldn't hold on to it. There were some errors that, again, contributed to some runs and some big innings that could have gotten you very much limited the damage, and the offense just didn't have enough to come back. And Florida State loses the series and the ACC at the same time, the regular season ACC. Now, you can certainly make up for that by what you do in Durham, which we'll talk about in a minute. But do you wonder a little bit about just where their minds are after that? Like, how hard is it, or is it really easy to just kind of like flush it and move on and say like, all right, we're worried about Durham. We're not worried about what happened at Syracuse?
I think if you're a fan of anything, it's so easy on the outside to look in and say and just speculate, right? And say like, well, what are they doing? What are they thinking right now? How are they performing like that, knowing what we have the next couple of weeks? But again, it's so much easier on the outside to say that and think those things as opposed to being on the other side of it and the amount of pressure that Florida State is feeling right now, because again, they have been that powerhouse the last couple of years. And they know what their reality is right now. They know the areas that they're struggling in. You already mentioned it. Defense has been something that's been predominantly really strong for Florida State. It's looked a little shaky the last couple of weeks. And so they're not naive to what they're going through. So again, I think on the outside, it's very easy and very common to speculate. But on the inside and being a part of that circle, being a part of, what it feels like to go through the grind, it's just kind of that roller coaster. You're going to ride the ups and the downs. You just never want to get too high up and you never want to get too far down. So I think if you're Florida State, you're feeling okay headed into the week.
The reality is, even though Syracuse may have been us at our worst or close to worst, just 2 weeks ago, we went into Florida and beat the absolute tar out of a team that might be a national seed. And the truth of the matter is, Florida State's probably somewhere in the middle of those. At their very best, they can go out and smack anybody. At their very worst, they can lose to anybody. Like it's just, there's a higher ceiling, but there might be a higher floor with this season too. But I think that's probably the best perspective for fans anyway, is to say like, yeah, last weekend stunk, but they've shown over the last few weeks that they're not necessarily that team. Now, at their worst, at anybody's worst, they could get, Florida, if you'd have told them they were going to give up 12 runs in an inning, they'd have been like, no chance. Like, we would never do that. And then it happened. So I feel like the team is probably somewhere in the middle, and the hope for the fans and the hope for the team, I'm sure too, is to be closer to where that Florida game was, where you got some maybe unexpected pitching performances from Wilson and Gooden that maybe you weren't expecting. And if they can reset, which Koja took them on a trip to see the Bills and Niagara Falls, and they've been eating buffalo wings and stuff all through the week that you see posted everywhere. If they can reset, I think they'll be in a lot better spot heading into the tournament.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think right now, just even from a national perspective, the game is on such an even playing field as opposed to back when I played, even in 2017 was my last year. And with the transfer portal, with NIL, with so many doors and avenues opening for these athletes, it's not necessarily always just, one or two top programs anymore. The talent is so widespread. And so, yeah, on any given Sunday, you can lose and you can get beat, and you can't just throw your glove out there on the field and expect to walk away with a win. You've got to show up and you've got to play great softball.
So heading into the ACC tournament, they'll take on the winner of the 7-10 game, Notre Dame or UNC. They went 6-0 against those teams this year, really dominated, right? Like, I was up there for the Notre Dame series. I watched North Carolina, which was senior weekend, and they were really good in both those series. And it was kind of, they knew they had to be good, just like they knew they had to be good against Syracuse. Like, the only path for them getting the 1 seed down the stretch was to literally win out. And they weren't able to do that, but they knew that when they were playing Notre Dame. They knew that when they were playing UNC. And so, now, again, you have to be at your best at any point, but Florida State should be able to go out and have a very good chance against either one of those teams as the 2 seed. Do you think one matchup favors Florida State more than the other?
I'm going to say I don't think either favors. I do think I agree Florida State's sitting in the driver's seat no matter who they're going to face on that first day. On Thursday evening. And so just kind of looking ahead, again, they've played 3-game series against both programs, which is of benefit to Florida State because, again, you put your offense up to another team's offense, like player for player, you want to see who has more depth. And Florida State has that right now. Again, the question in the circle is whose pitching depth is going to be greater, Florida State or whoever their opponent is. And I think that's right now the line in the sand. And not to say the pitchers can't get it done. It's just going to be a sincere combined effort between a full pitching staff as well as a very dominant offense throughout the next several weeks, which is the rest of the season. And so I think if you're Florida State, I have the opinion, like, it doesn't matter who we're playing. I think that we're going to have a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity against either side, whether it is UNC or Notre Dame.
I will get right back to talking with Alex about FSU softball, but first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my friends over at the Mango Board. Now, they are a group that aims to educate and inspire folks on basically why they should be eating more of the greatest fruit of all time. Listen, there are a lot of great fruits out there. Nothing is quite like a mango, though. My kids beg for them every time we go to the store, and then when we get home, they eat them so much faster than I can actually cut them. I'm not selling you anything. You don't have to go click a link or put in a code. Just the next time that you're at your grocer, grab a mango or two. The Mango Board partners with FSU, as you can see on the screen, and they support their athletics. You may see them out at different sporting events through the year. If you do, stop by and say hello. And again, the next time you're at your local grocer, grab a mango or two. You will not be sad that you did. So if they win that game, they'll take on likely Virginia Tech. Now, some different things could happen and some things could shake out. But if the higher seeds advance, they'll take on VT, who isn't necessarily the Virginia Tech of old, of just a couple of years ago when they were very, very highly ranked in the country, but still a really good team. What does Virginia Tech do well, and where are some places that Florida State could potentially take advantage of Virginia Tech?
Yeah, Virginia Tech's offense has been historically the last several years extremely good. They've got a ton of power numbers. Florida State and Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech is going to sit in like the fifth spot, I think, nationally, fifth or sixth, and Florida State is in the spot right behind them as far as their offensive power numbers. And so that's saying a lot about what Virginia Tech has been able to put together with their bats. And so that's something that they consistently do really well. They have over 100 home runs so far this season. Their doubles are very significant, as well as their RBIs, their hits, the whole nine. Where Virginia Tech has been a little bit weaker the last couple of years is their pitching depth in the circle. They've had a decent pitcher in the circle the last couple of years trying to lead them, but then there was nobody behind her to come in and just try to secure, games 2 or 3 if she ever needed help. And so Florida State has that depth a little bit better. They don't have the dominance in the circle, but they do have the depth and arms in the numbers. And I think it's going to be a numbered game the next couple of weeks. And it's not going to be, like I said, it's not going to be the power game for Florida State in regard to pitchers. It's going to be the strategy and the matchups of what Lonnie puts together in the circle. And that's how they're going to beat teams, is better strategy and overthinking in a good way and in a constructive way. And then, of course, letting the bats continue to pick up any other slack. So,
yeah, the championship, a lot of people are penciling Duke in there. We'll talk about that in just a second. But I think at times she, speaking of Coach, I think she at times frustrates fans with some of the pitching matchups. And then most of the time reminds fans why she gets paid very, very well to coach at Florida State. You think about and I'll say I was guilty. In my mind, I try not to be pretty, very negative on social media, but in my mind, some of the pitching matchups, I mentioned the Florida game. I'm thinking, what is going on here? And she worked it to perfection and used all 3 pitchers extremely well, stuck with her plan. I remember in the World Series last year, people complained about the way that she started in the final series, and that worked incredibly well. Now, you just ran into a buzzsaw that was going to win no matter what, but she reminds people why she's really good with choosing what goes on in the circle. The biggest thing to me is, like you just said, I'd be pretty surprised if anybody went, pitched for 14 innings this weekend. It's going to be a very joint effort. If it is Duke on Saturday, Florida State Really wasn't super close to Duke the first time they played in game one of the series. Game two came out and played really well, pitched well, did just enough offensively. Game three, big comeback, ended up losing in extra innings, but had a lot of fight there. You lose the series 2-1, but sent a game to extra innings. So, as close as a series split or as close to a win for the series as you could have had. Duke, not necessarily unbeatable. Now, they win a lot of games, and they've got a lot of really good wins. They're top 3 in RPI right now still. But if it is Florida State Duke, how much does Florida State's experience of being there, doing that, doing it against Duke even, and I remember, you've got a lot of seniors, you've got a lot of people on this team who have been there and done that. How much will that help them on Saturday?
I think the experience is going to be so much of a factor, again, headed into the entire postseason the next couple of weeks. And that's the one area I feel like that Duke just hasn't shown me fully yet, because they do everything else, every aspect of the game so well. They pitch, they hit, they run the bases, they field. They're phenomenal in all, but they don't have the experience winning on the big stage. They get there, right? They hosted the Super Regional last year. Of course, they were the 8 seed, so then they got 9, which was Stanford coming to their park, and it was just a tough weekend for them. But that's what I'm saying, is they've not yet won on the big stage. And that's where I think Duke is going to struggle the most, or has struggled the most. But I'm really excited to see what they do the next couple of weeks. But for Florida State, experience alone is why I continue to even push that Florida State still could be a contender deep into postseason, potentially World Series, simply because they have that been there, done that mentality and just knowledge, which is so important.
Yeah, if they play, a lot of doom and gloom because of a rough three games, or a rough 2 days, 48 hours, 24 hours, whatever. But this team was a team that won like 22 of 24 games going into that. It was on a really good streak. You run into a tough weekend, and all hope is not necessarily lost. You go out and have a good showing this week, especially if you win 2 games and lose a tough one to a top 5 team in Duke. I think you really set yourself up for, okay, well, can we be at home the next weekend, right? And if we're at home, can we find a way to squeak out 3 wins at home? And then who knows what happens in a best of 3 series. We've seen some magic both ways on that. So, Alex, where can people follow you? Where can they find your work? Where can they watch you? Tell me your schedule for this week on the ACC Network.
Yeah, so we're here with the ACC Network. It's myself, another analyst, Britt McKinney, and then our host, Taylor Tannenbaum. She's also a former Nole, doing stuff with the ACC Network. We're hosting a lot of pre- and post-game shows throughout the week on the ACC Network, which is where all the games will be played, except for the championship, which is going to be on ESPN2. But you can catch us, like I said, before and after every single game on the network, on social media, of course. Instagram's my jam. I'm still okay with Twitter. I have Twitter, not super big on it, like in regard to all my posts and stuff. But so Instagram and ACC Network, it's good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Go Noles.
Go Noles.